Hi, I'm Chrissy Mack from Radio Northern Beaches, and you've just tuned in to the Listen and Chat with Chrissy Mack podcast. This is the space where we pull no punches, sometimes a little controversial, sometimes downright outrageous, and sometimes just packed full of information that is interesting to know. Welcome back. Now, if you've turned on a TV, opened a newspaper, or scrolled through social media over the last couple of weeks, you already know that federal politics has been incredibly noisy lately. Between the endless media spotlight and the collective faux pas we've seen from Pauline Hanson's One Nation, the political spin machine is running at absolute full speed. But today I don't want to add to that noise. I don't want to get bogged down in the finger pointing or the daily shouting matches. Instead, I want to take a breath, step back and actually look at the facts. When political parties start throwing out massive headline-grabbing policy announcements, it is very easy to get lost in the slogans. So I wanted to simplify things for you. I wanted to look under the hood and compare what the federal Labor government, the Liberal coalition opposition and the One Nation are actually saying. And crucially, look at the legalities and the real-world consequences of what is being suggested. To help us do that, I've put together a comprehensive comparison table that you can view on my Facebook page, Listen and Chat with Chrissy Mack. Now, the table breaks down the main policies of the parties, but together I want to concentrate on housing and the realities of Pauline Hanson's One Nation policies. Do they discriminate? Or can a government actually apply these policies, and what are the consequences that elsewhere arise? I know everyone listens to the radio with a different level of interest in what's happening in Canberra. So I built this online resource with 3 specific groups of people in mind. First, it's for those of you who don't normally follow politics at all. You're busy, you've got a lot on your plate, but you still want a quick, clear guide on how these proposed laws might actually impact your day-to-day life, your family and your wallet. Second, it's for those who feel totally confused and overwhelmed by everything currently being thrown at them. When one party says a policy will save the country and another says it will ruin it, it's exhausting. This table strips away the emotion and lays out the straightforward pros and cons. And third, this is for those of you who mostly understand politics and follow it closely, but still need to sort out the honesty behind the rhetoric. We're looking at the actual legal boundaries here, because a policy sounds great as a slogan, but if it violates the Australian Constitution or breaks international law, the public deserves to know the real consequences. So if you can, jump online and open up the table and take a look. Let's dive straight into the issue that is front and centre for almost everyone right now: housing. Let's look at what is being promised, what is actually legal, and what it really means to you. Let's make an analysis of discrimination and historic policy alignment. When evaluating whether these policies overlap with historical frameworks like the White Australian Policy, the Immigration Restriction Act 1901, which explicitly used racial and national origin criteria to restrict non-white migration, or violate modern anti-discrimination laws, the distinctions lie in whether a policy targets nationality, residential status versus race or ethnicity. So, under domestic and international law, governments have the legal right to regulate economic activity based on visa category, residency or citizenship status. Both the current Labor government and the previous coalition government have alternatively used restrictions and extra taxes on foreign investors. Labor's current ban on foreign purchases of established home is perfectly legal because it applies to all non-residents globally, regardless of race, country of origin or background. The One Nation's proposal of forcing non-residents to sell property is a drastic escalation of economic nationalism, but because it targets legal residency status, applying equally to a wealthy British investor living in London, a Canadian temporary worker, or an investor from Asia, it does not legally constitute racial discrimination under the current framework. While the housing policies themselves are written in terms of citizenship status rather than race, the broader rhetoric surrounding them receives varying levels of scrutiny. Both major parties frame their housing policies around standard economic mechanics, supply-demand infrastructure, and targeted immigration caps linked to skills and housing capacity. Their policies explicitly include and support permanent migrants of all backgrounds. While One Nation's clarified housing policy uses non-discriminatory legal definitions, temporary visa holders and foreign citizens, critics and political analysts frequently note that the policy is marketed alongside the party's broader platform. This platform includes calls for assimilation, a halt to multiculturalism, and highly restrictive caps on immigration. Because of the broader context, critics argue that the party's housing policies leverage nationalism sentiments that echo elements of the earliest 20th century isolationism. However, strictly speaking, a policy that prioritises Australian citizens and permanent residents of all racial and ethnic backgrounds differs fundamentally from the historical White Australia policy, which was explicitly defined by race. A closer look at how these positions shape the broader political landscape reveals further nuances in the ongoing debate. So now let's look at the constitutional challenges, the just terms hurdle. If a federal government attempts to repossess property or legally force a sale under the terms that result in the loss to an owner, it immediately collides with the Australian Constitution. Let's look at Section 51/31 of the Constitution. This section grants the Commonwealth the power to acquire property, but explicitly states it must be done on just terms. The just terms requirement is that the High Court of Australia has consistently interpreted just terms to mean fair compensation, usually equal to market value. If the government possesses a property without paying market value, the law would be struck down as unconstitutional. A government might argue that forcing someone to sell their house on the open market is a regulation of foreign investment rather than a direct acquisition by the state. However, the High Court takes a very wide view of what constitutes an acquisition. If the law deprives a person of their property rights or forces a fire sale that strips them of financial value, it is highly likely to be challenged as an invalid use of Commonwealth power. When assessing whether these policies cross into discrimination or historical racial framework, like the White Australian policy, the law looks strictly at the text and intent. Under Australian law, discrimination is based on race, colour, descent and national ethnicity of origin. Under Australian law, discrimination based on race, colour, descent or national/ethnic origins is illegal under the Racial Discriminations Act of 1975. However, discriminating between citizens/permanent residents and temporary visa holders, as well as foreign non-residents, is a standard legal function of national sovereignty. Because One Nation's proposed policy targets residency and citizenship status rather than ethnicity, it does not legally constitute racial discrimination. It applies equally to investors from UK, Canada, China or New Zealand. While the policy may bypass domestic racial discrimination laws by focusing on citizenship status, it faces a major hurdle under international law. Australia has a strict bilateral investment treaties and FTAs, such as with the US, the UK, New Zealand and various Asian nations. These agreements contain investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS clauses, or national treatment provisions. These treaties legally bind Australia to treat foreign investors from those nations no less favourably than domestic investors. Forcing a British or American non-resident investor to sell their home while allowing an Australian investor to keep theirs would breach these international treaties. Foreign citizens could sue the Australian government in international tribunals for damages potentially costing taxpayers billions of dollars in compensation. While major parties rely on prospective bans, stopping future buyers, and taxation to manage demand safely within the constitutional bounds, a retrospective forced divestment policy is legally untested and highly exposed to constitutional invalidity under Section 531, as well as severe penalties under the international trade law. Well, there you have it, the most simplified breakdown I can give you on where the major parties stand on housing. What becomes clear when you look closely at these proposals is that any policy introducing retrospective forced asset sales requires very careful scrutiny. From a strictly legal standpoint, we aren't just talking about political debate. We are talking about measures that would face immediate and significant tests in both our own High Court and international trade tribunals. But it's not just a courtroom issue, it's a market one. Analysts warn that a sudden wave of forced property sales could cause an economic shock, destabilising the broader market and rapidly reducing the equity that everyday Australian homeowners have worked so hard to build. As voters and taxpayers, the real question we have to ask ourselves is whether we want to pursue policies that carry a very high risk of tying up public funds in lengthy, expensive, constitutional and international court battles. Slogans are simple, but the legal and financial consequences for Australians are incredibly complex. Whether this policy would help or hurt young home buyers depends entirely on which side of the property ladder you are currently standing on. It creates a sharp divide between those trying to buy their first home and those who have just managed to purchase one. If a policy forces thousands of foreign owners or temporary resident properties onto the market simultaneously, housing supply surges while local demands stay the same. According to basic economic theory, this oversupply would likely push property prices down, making it cheaper and easier for the younger people to save a deposit and enter the market. Young buyers would no longer have to compete against well-capitalised overseas investors or temporary residents looking to buy locally, theoretically giving them a clearer run at entry-level properties. Then we have to look at the danger of negative equity. This is the biggest risk for young people who bought a home recently with a small deposit, e.g. 5 or 10%. If a policy causes property values to drop sharply, these young homeowners could instantly fall into negative equity, meaning they owe more to the bank than their house is actually worth. A young family in negative equity cannot easily refinance their mortgage to get a better interest rate, and if they need to sell a home due to a job change or lifestyle shift, they would have to pay the bank the financial shortfall out of their own pocket. If the housing market experiences an artificial shock and prices plummet, banks typically respond by becoming incredibly strict with their lending criteria. They may demand much larger deposits, 20% or more, and tighter income tests, which would ironically lock the next wave of young buyers out of the market entirely, despite lower listing prices. And I haven't even started on the investment side of things, but that's for another day. Thank you for tuning in today. Don't forget to jump online to my Facebook, Listen and Chat with Chrissy Mack, and look over the comparison table for yourself and form your own conclusions. Until next time, I'm your host, Chrissy Mack from Radio Northern Beaches, and don't forget these are my conclusions and not necessarily those of the station. So keep asking the hard questions. All right, I hope I've given you a lot to think about and talk about and debate and maybe disagree with. Don't forget to follow, like and share. Stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.